John Mackenzie, a lonely farmer in Arizona in 1885, offers his last slice of bread to a wounded Apache he finds on his land. This simple act of compassion sets off a chain of events that will change his life forever. When 500 Apache warriors surround his property the next day, John discovers that small gestures of humanity can have immense consequences, both dangerous and transformative. A story about redemption, cultural understanding, and how kindness can build bridges even in the most violent times of the American frontier. The sun was beating down mercilessly on my weathered hands as I fixed the broken fence post for the third time that month. September in Arizona Territory was supposed to be cooler, but 1885 seemed determined to prove everyone wrong. Sweat dripped into my eyes, stinging like the memories I'd been trying to forget for the past 2 years. My name is John Mackenzie, and I'd been working this patch of desert for longer than I cared to remember. 43 years old, with nothing but calloused hands and a stubborn streak to show for it. The ranch wasn't much, just a small cabin, a barn that had seen better days and enough land to graze maybe 30 head of cattle. But it was mine, earned through blood, sweat, and more heartache than any man should carry. I was hammering the last nail when I heard it, a low moan coming from behind the old oak tree near the creek. My first instinct was to reach for the rifle propped against the fence, but something in that sound made me pause. It wasn't the growl of a mountain lion or the snort of an angry bull. It was human pain, raw and desperate. Moving cautiously through the dried grass, I found him lying in the shade, an Apache warrior, probably no more than 25, with a bullet wound in his shoulder that had been bleeding for who knows how long. His breathing was shallow, and his dark eyes tracked my movement with the wariness of a trapped animal. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Here was everything I'd been taught to fear and hate, an Apache on my land, armed with a knife that gleamed despite the blood on his buckskin shirt. The smart thing would have been to put him out of his misery or ride to town for the cavalry. That's what any reasonable rancher would do. But those eyes, they held something I recognized, the same exhaustion I saw in my own reflection every morning, the same bone-deep weariness that comes from losing everything that matters. "Water," he whispered in broken English, his voice barely audible. I found myself walking back to the cabin without really deciding to. My late wife Sarah's voice echoed in my memory. "John Mackenzie, you've got a heart bigger than this whole territory, and someday it's going to get you in trouble." She'd said that to me 100 times, usually while bandaging up some stray animal I'd brought home. Sarah had been gone for 2 years now, taken by the same fever that swept through the territory that terrible winter. Since then, I'd been existing more than living, going through the motions of ranch life without much purpose. The loneliness had settled into my bones like arthritis, a constant ache I'd learned to ignore. I grabbed the water jug and what was left of the bread I'd baked that morning, just one thick slice, crusty and still warm. It was supposed to be my dinner, the last food in the house until I could ride to town tomorrow. But looking at this young man who was clearly dying, I couldn't bring myself to care about my empty stomach. When I returned, the Apache's eyes had closed, but he was still breathing. I knelt beside him, lifted his head gently and held the jug to his lips. He drank desperately, water running down his chin and mixing with the dirt on his neck. "Easy now," I found myself saying, the same tone I'd used with injured horses. "Don't drink too fast." He opened his eyes and looked at me with something that might have been gratitude. I tore the bread into small pieces and helped him eat bite by bite. It wasn't much, but color started returning to his face. As I examined his wound, I realized the bullet had passed clean through, painful and bloody, but not fatal if treated properly. I'd seen enough gunshot wounds during my time as a buffalo soldier before I'd settled here. The bleeding had mostly stopped, but infection was the real danger now. "I should leave you to die," I said, more to myself than to him. Any sensible man would. He understood more English than he'd let on because he nodded slightly. "Yes," he whispered, "you should." But I found myself tearing strips from my own shirt to make bandages. Sarah had always said I was too stubborn for my own good, and she was probably watching from somewhere, shaking her head at my foolishness. As I worked, the Apache warrior studied my face. "Why?" he asked. It was a fair question. The Apache and the settlers had been killing each other for decades. Just last month, I'd heard about the Martinez family being attacked 20 miles south. The territorial government had put bounties on Apache scalps. This man lying here could have been one of the raiders who'd terrorized the countryside. "Because," I said, securing the makeshift bandage, "my wife always said that when you've got nothing left but your humanity, that's when it matters most." I helped him sit up against the oak tree, making sure he was comfortable in the shade. The sun was starting to set, painting the desert in shades of gold and red that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with this harsh land in the first place. "My name is John Mackenzie," I said, offering him the last of the water. He was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Nalnish." I nodded, committing the name to memory. We sat in companionable silence as darkness fell, two men from different worlds, sharing the same patch of desert. I should have been afraid, but instead I felt something I hadn't experienced in 2 years, a sense of purpose. Little did I know that this simple act of sharing my last piece of bread would set in motion events that would change everything. By tomorrow, my quiet ranch would become the center of something much larger than either of us could have imagined. I woke before dawn to the sound of hoofbeats, dozens of them moving like thunder across the desert floor. My eyes snapped open in the pre-dawn darkness, and my hand instinctively reached for the Winchester beside my bed. Through the cabin window, I could see shadows moving in the distance, but the darkness made it impossible to count how many. Nalnish was still where I'd left him the night before, propped against the oak tree. I'd checked on him twice during the night, bringing him more water and changing his bandage. The fever had broken around midnight, and his breathing had steadied. Now, in the pale light of dawn, I could see him sitting upright, alert and watching the horizon with eyes that held knowledge I didn't yet possess. "Your people?" I asked, moving toward him with my rifle in hand. He nodded slowly. "They come for me." My mouth went dry. In all my years on the frontier, I'd heard the stories. Apache war parties that could appear like ghosts and disappear just as quickly, leaving devastation in their wake. The smart thing would be to put distance between myself and Nalnish, maybe even use him as a bargaining chip. But looking at this young man I'd shared my last bread with, I couldn't bring myself to think of him as a threat. The hoofbeats grew closer, and I could make out individual riders now, 20, 30, then more, until it seemed like the entire horizon was filled with mounted warriors. They moved with a precision that spoke of years of warfare, spreading out in a wide circle that gradually tightened around my property like a noose. "How many?" I asked, though I was already dreading the answer. "Many," Nalnish replied, struggling to his feet. I moved to help him, forgetting for a moment that this might be the last act of kindness I'd ever perform. Maybe 500, maybe more. 500 Apache warriors. The number hit me like a physical blow. I'd heard of war parties this size, but they were the stuff of legend, the kind that wiped entire settlements off the map. And here they were, surrounding my little ranch because I'd given water and bread to one of their own. The circle tightened until I could see individual faces, painted for war, carrying rifles and traditional weapons. They moved with the fluid grace of men who'd been born on horseback, and their silence was more terrifying than any war cry. They simply sat their horses, watching, waiting. Then, from the center of the group, 3 riders approached. The man in the lead was older, maybe 50, with silver streaking his long black hair and scars that told stories of countless battles. His presence commanded respect, even from a distance. This was clearly a war chief, someone whose word could mean life or death for everyone in this desert. They stopped about 50 yards from where Nalnish and I stood. The war chief's eyes moved between us, taking in the bandages on the young warrior's shoulder, the way I stood protectively near him, despite holding a rifle. Nalnish called out something in Apache, his voice carrying across the desert silence. It was a long speech, filled with words I didn't understand but delivered with an intensity that made my heart pound. When he finished, the war chief responded, and even though I couldn't understand the language, I could hear surprise in his voice. "What did you tell him?" I asked quietly. "I told him about the bread," Nalnish replied. "About the water, about how you could have left me to die, but instead you shared your last food." The war chief dismounted and walked toward us, his movements deliberate and measured. Up close, I could see the intelligence in his eyes, the calculating way he studied me. This wasn't a man driven by bloodlust or simple hatred. This was a leader making decisions that would affect his people's survival. He spoke to Nalnish again, then turned to me. In surprisingly clear English, he said, "I am Geronimo." The name sent a chill down my spine. Geronimo, the Apache leader whose name was whispered in fear throughout the Southwest. The man the army had been chasing for years, whose raids had become legendary for their daring and brutality. And now he stood 10 feet away from me, studying my face like he was reading my soul. "You are the rancher who fed my nephew," he continued, "who gave him your last bread when you could have let him die." Nephew. That explained why 500 warriors had come for one wounded man. But it also meant my situation had just become infinitely more complicated. "Any decent man would have done the same," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Geronimo's weathered face showed the ghost of a smile. "No," he said. "Any decent white man would have shot him and claimed the bounty on his scalp." The truth of those words hung heavy in the morning air. How many times had I heard men in town bragging about Apache kills? How many times had I seen the hatred in their eyes when they talked about the Indian problem? "Then maybe I'm not like other white men," I said. For what felt like an eternity, Geronimo studied me. Behind him, 500 warriors waited in perfect silence, their horses shifting restlessly, but their discipline absolute. My life hung in the balance of whatever decision this legendary war chief was making. If you're following this story and feeling the tension I felt in that moment, tell me from which place in the world you're listening to this. I'd love to know how far this tale of an impossible morning in Arizona has traveled. "My nephew tells me you spoke of your wife," Geronimo finally said, "that she taught you about humanity when you have nothing left." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "I had a wife too," he continued, his voice carrying a pain that transcended language and culture. "3 wives, 8 children, all killed by your people's soldiers while I was away hunting." The weight of his loss settled over me like a shroud. Here was a man who had every reason to hate, to kill, to destroy everything connected to the people who had taken his family, and yet he stood here talking instead of attacking. The silence stretched between us like a taut rope ready to snap. Geronimo's words about his murdered family hung in the air, and I could feel the weight of 500 pairs of eyes watching every breath I took. The morning sun was climbing higher, casting long shadows across the desert, but the heat building around us had nothing to do with the weather. "Your soldiers came to our village in winter," Geronimo continued, his voice steady but carrying decades of grief. "They said we had broken treaty by leaving the reservation to hunt. My family was sleeping when the bullets came. I wanted to say something, anything, but what words could possibly bridge that kind of loss? Instead, I found myself thinking about Sarah, about how I'd felt when fever took her. But my grief was natural, inevitable. His had been deliberate, calculated violence. "I'm sorry," I finally managed. The words felt inadequate, but they were all I had. He nodded once, acknowledging not just my words, but the sincerity behind them. Then he surprised me by sitting down in the dirt, cross-legged, as if we were old friends sharing a meal instead of enemies negotiating for lives. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the ground beside him. I hesitated. Sitting would mean putting down my rifle, making myself vulnerable. But standing while he sat would be disrespectful, and disrespect could get me killed faster than any show of weakness. I set the Winchester aside and lowered myself to the ground, acutely aware of how exposed this made me. "Your wife?" Geronimo said. "What was her name?" "Sarah. Sarah Mackenzie. Tell me about Sarah Mackenzie." It seemed like an odd request from a war chief surrounded by an army, but something in his tone made me comply. She was everything good about this world. Taught school in town before we married. Could make anything grow, even in this desert. She'd take in stray animals, bandage up anyone who came to our door hurt. "Ah," Geronimo said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "She taught you to see people, not enemies." I nodded, surprised by his insight. "She used to say that kindness was the only thing that multiplied when you gave it away." For the first time since this confrontation began, Geronimo smiled, not the ghost of a smile, but something genuine. "My first wife, Alope, said something similar. She said hatred was like carrying hot coals. It burns the one who holds it most." We sat in that strange communion for several minutes, 2 men who'd lost everything that mattered, finding unexpected common ground in our grief. Around us, the warriors waited with the patience of people who understood that some conversations couldn't be rushed. Then Geronimo's expression grew serious again. "My nephew tells me you are alone on this land. No family, no workers, no neighbors close enough to help." "That's right," I confirmed, wondering where this was leading. "And yet, you helped him, knowing it could bring trouble." I didn't really think about trouble. I just saw a man who needed help. Geronimo studied my face for a long moment. "This is why you are still alive. This is why 500 warriors sit their horses instead of burning your buildings." The implication was clear. They could have attacked at dawn, overwhelmed me before I knew what was happening. Instead, they'd chosen to talk first, and that choice had saved my life. "But now we have a problem," Geronimo continued. "My nephew cannot travel for several days. The wound needs time to heal properly. And my people, they have been moving for weeks, staying ahead of your army. We need a place to rest, to tend our own wounded, to let our horses recover." I began to understand where this conversation was heading, and the magnitude of what he was suggesting made my head spin. You want to make camp here on my land. Not want, he corrected. Need. The next water is 2 days' ride, and we have children and elders who cannot make that journey without rest. The enormity of the situation hit me like a physical blow. He was asking me to hide 500 Apache warriors, including the most wanted man in the Southwest, on my property. If the army discovered this, I wouldn't just be arrested for treason, I'd be hanged without trial. If other ranchers found out, they'd form a lynch mob before sunset. You're asking me to commit suicide, I said bluntly. I am asking you to continue being the man who shared his last bread with a stranger. The simple statement cut through all my fear and calculation. This wasn't about politics or war, or the complicated history between our peoples. This was about the choice I'd made yesterday when I found Nalnish bleeding under that oak tree. The choice to see a human being instead of an enemy. If I agree, I said slowly, what guarantee do I have that your people won't kill me once they're rested? You have my word. And what's your word worth to a dead man? Geronimo's laugh was sharp but not unkind. Fair question. Let me tell you what my word is worth. He gestured toward the warriors surrounding us. These men follow me not because they fear me, but because they trust me. For 30 years, I have led raids against your people, and I have never broken my word to warrior or enemy. When I say you will live, you will live. The certainty in his voice was somehow more convincing than any oath or promise could have been. What comes next is even stronger. And to not miss the ending, think about hitting that subscribe button now. It's free, and you'll be with me for every new story I share. And if I refuse, I asked, then we take the water we need and move on. You will live, because you earned that right yesterday. But my nephew might die from traveling too soon, and others might die from thirst before we reach the next spring. He was giving me a choice, but it wasn't really a choice at all. Not for a man who'd spent his last piece of bread on a stranger. How long would you need to stay? 3 days, maybe 4. I looked around at the warriors, at the vast circle of armed men who could wipe me from existence with a word from their leader. Then I looked at Nalnish, still pale but alive, because I'd chosen compassion over caution. All right, I heard myself saying, but we do this my way. The next 3 days changed everything I thought I knew about life, death, and the thin line between civilization and survival. What started as an impossible request from a legendary war chief became something I never could have imagined, a glimpse into a world where enemies could become allies, where understanding could bloom in the harshest soil. Geronimo was true to his word about doing things my way, but I quickly learned that my way needed to accommodate the practical needs of 500 people who had been living as fugitives for months. The logistics alone should have been impossible, but the Apache moved with an efficiency that spoke of years perfecting the art of survival. They made camp in the natural depression behind my property, invisible from the main trail, but close enough to my creek to access water. I watched in amazement as they transformed the landscape into a temporary village within hours. Wiki-ups appeared as if by magic. Fires were lit in spots that dispersed smoke naturally, and sentries took positions that covered every possible approach. But it was the small moments that truly opened my eyes. I saw warriors tenderly caring for elderly members of the band, children playing games that looked remarkably similar to ones I'd played as a boy in Missouri, and women working with plants and medicines that showed a knowledge of this land deeper than anything I'd ever learned. On the second morning, I was checking my cattle when I found Nalnish sitting by the creek, moving his wounded arm in careful circles. The color had returned to his face, and the bandages I'd made from my shirt had been replaced with some kind of traditional Apache dressing that smelled of herbs I couldn't identify. Your arm is better, I observed. He nodded, then surprised me by asking, will you teach me to read English words? I stared at him. You want to learn to read? My uncle says the future belongs to those who understand both worlds. I speak your language, but books hold power I do not have. So that afternoon, I found myself sitting in the shade of my cabin with an Apache warrior, using my late wife's Bible to teach him letters and sounds. It felt surreal, but also strangely natural. Sarah would have approved. She'd always believed education was the one thing nobody could take from you. Word spread through the camp, and soon other young warriors were joining our lessons. Geronimo himself would sometimes listen from a distance, never participating but clearly approving. During one of these informal schools, he told me something that changed my understanding of everything that was happening. You think we are here by accident, he said, settling beside me as I helped a teenage warrior sound out words from a newspaper, that we found your ranch by chance. I paused in my teaching. Weren't you? Nalnish was not alone when he was shot. He was with a scouting party looking for safe passage to Mexico. They were attacked by cavalry near your southern fence line. His companions brought him as far as your property before they had to retreat. The implications hit me slowly. They could have taken him with them, yes, but they had seen you before, working your cattle, fixing your fences, treating the land with respect instead of trying to dominate it. They had seen you help an injured horse on the trail, not knowing anyone was watching. They knew what kind of man you were before they left Nalnish in your care. I felt my worldview shifting again. This hadn't been a random encounter. It had been a test, or maybe a calculated risk based on careful observation. These people had been watching me, judging my character, long before that fateful day when I'd shared my last bread. Why tell me this now? I asked. Because tomorrow we leave and I want you to understand what you have become. That evening, as the Apache prepared for departure, Geronimo approached me one final time. In his hands he carried something wrapped in soft buckskin. A gift, he explained, though gifts seemed inadequate for what had passed between us. Inside the wrapping was a knife, but not just any knife. The blade was steel, obviously taken from some unfortunate soldier, but the handle was carved bone inlaid with turquoise and silver. It was beautiful and functional, a weapon and a work of art. This belonged to my son, Geronimo said simply. He died fighting your cavalry 2 winters ago. He was Nalnish's age, and like him, he believed the future would require understanding both worlds. The weight of the gift, not just physical but emotional, nearly overwhelmed me. I can't accept this. You must. When the cavalry comes asking questions, and they will come, you show them this knife. You tell them you took it from a dead Apache. They will believe you because you are white, and they will not look deeper into how Apache came to be on your land. His foresight proved accurate. 2 weeks after the band had vanished into the desert like morning mist, a cavalry patrol did arrive. They'd found signs of a large group moving through the area and were following the trail. I showed them the knife, told them I'd found it near a dead warrior I'd buried, and they accepted the story without question. A white rancher who'd killed an Apache and taken his weapon was exactly what they expected to hear. But the real gift Geronimo had given me wasn't the knife, it was perspective. As I stood in my doorway, watching the cavalry ride away, satisfied with their simple explanation for a complex truth, I realized that Sarah had been right about kindness multiplying when you give it away. That single piece of bread I'd shared with Nalnish had returned to me 100-fold, not just in the safety Geronimo had granted me, but in the education I'd received about the people I'd been taught to fear. I'd learned that Apache children laughed at the same silly things white children did, that their elders told stories around fires just like my grandfather had, that their young men worried about the future and dreamed of better times. If this story touched something in you, if it made you think about the bridges we might build instead of the walls we often choose, tell me from which corner of the world you're hearing this tale. Stories like this need to travel far and wide. Most importantly, I'd learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is also the most necessary. Choosing to see the humanity in those you've been told are your enemies. The Apache were gone, but they'd left me something more valuable than any knife. The understanding that one act of simple human kindness can change everything if you're brave enough to let it.